Welcome to today's presentation, Create a Plan to Secure Your Nonprofit Against Online Threats, hosted by the 501 Secure program at the Mabel G. Ragland Institute in Spokane, Washington. 501 Secure supports nonprofits in their efforts to protect against online threats and scams by providing free resources, vendor-neutral advice, live remote cybersecurity awareness trainings, mentoring for folks who might find themselves in the position of an accidental IT admin, and customized cybersecurity assessment and planning services. The Ragland Institute offers lifelong learning opportunities for adults, and it supports nonprofits around the U.S. through capacity building and mentoring services in cybersecurity and also team management. And you can find us at raglandinstitute.org. My name is Kai Daly. I am the Executive Director of Ragland Institute, and I will be your host and presenter over the next hour. I've worked in nonprofit tech exclusively since 2016, most recently as Chief Information Security Officer at a nonprofit capacity building organization in Seattle. I acquired much of my IT experience providing business process analysis beginning in the late 1980s. Both informally as an employee and later as a consultant and to business and nonprofits. So today I'm going to talk specifically about how to identify your most important assets and how to use that process to get your team involved in building a security program. And then I'll talk about the next steps needed to implement protection measures. But first, what kind of threats are we trying to protect against? First of all, it's threats to your data, your accounts, or your access to accounts, and the processes that you use in your organization to get your work done. And these are threatened by very common risks that are targeted widely in the nonprofit sector and also in the for-profit sector. That's phishing and whaling. Malware, ransomware, hacking, and internal threats. So phishing is your generic email that's unsolicited generally and offers some kind of promise or bait, as they say. There's a link or there's an attachment, and if you click on the link or you download the attachment, it's accompanied by malware that's will infect your system or swipe information in your browser and can often find its way to access your accounts or your passwords. Whaling is a similar threat, but it's focused on individuals, usually leaders of an organization. And malware is what you may find installed by clicking on a phishing link. Ransomware also can be installed by clicking on a phishing link. And then the hacking, you've got cyber criminals who are trying to access financial information or to steal your money. There are also a variety called hacktivists who simply access your internal information or maybe even sabotage your websites as a way of protest against something that an organization might be doing that they object. This is also a common problem for NGOs that may be, say, working on human rights in countries that find their work objectionable, and state actors will actually get involved in a type of hacktivism in order to bring down those NGOs' online presence. The other area is the financial, regulatory, and reputational threats. So if you are targeted, for example, by a scam where your accounting team accidentally pays something that is fraudulent, you could be losing money there. Perhaps you have a large data breach and you are on the hook for any damages that as a result of that, or having to report to a regulatory agency that a breach occurred, or maybe you have to send an email out informing all of the people whose data has been exposed. Having to go public with the fact that happened, it can be devastating for an organization. So by putting security in place, that you can prevent a lot of these threats or reduce the amount of impact the threats can have in your organization. But it is something that you can't 100% protect against. but you can significantly reduce the risk. Before you jump into a inventory project, I recommend getting as much learning under your belt as possible. There is so much information online, and I will send out a link with the recording to this video with sources online that we recommend. But there's a tremendous amount of opportunities for learning. Once you get a sense of what you're trying to protect in your organization, exactly how do you know that you've protected it? What is the standard? So in cybersecurity, there is a standard called the CIA Triad, and that stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality basically means that no one can access information that shouldn't have access to it. Integrity means that you can trust your data, your communications, for example, that your email hasn't been tampered with between the time it was sent by a colleague and when it arrived, and or that your processes are working as appropriate. For example, you're connecting your Salesforce database to MailChimp, that nothing is interfering with that process, and that the data is arriving back into Salesforce as you would expect it to. And availability means that you have access to Salesforce, you have access to MailChimp, that your database is there when you need it, that nobody has interfered with the availability. And availability can be hampered by not just cyber criminals, but also natural disasters or mistakes by employees. And so part of the process of protecting yourself is also being ready to respond when an incident happens, having backups, having offline processes and instructions on how to accomplish those if you had a significant incident. So over the past 4 years, I've helped nonprofits build cybersecurity programs for their organizations. And I've learned that nonprofits benefit from mapping their own path to security and getting as many team members involved as possible. This means hands-on engagement rather than simply everyone taking a training. Small organizations in particular need to combine security, governance, accountability, and training into their awareness programs. So not just videos and quizzes, because videos are really just compliance activities. They're not going to change your culture. Building a security program, even for a small nonprofit, is a big job. So I learned that it is important to narrow the task to a manageable size for an organization where staff holds multiple roles. One person cannot achieve a whole organization awareness alone. Building a cybersecurity awareness program protects data and assets critical to an organization's function, not just the technology, but the data and the business processes. An asset inventory which is the main topic of our talk today, is the first hands-on task to building security and awareness. It starts with getting up to speed on risk and basic cybersecurity concepts. And then you make a list of what you need to protect in your organization. Then you analyze that list, prioritize and make plans, and then reach out for advice externally if you need it, if you don't have in-house advice, on how to do specific controls, which we'll talk about. And then you want to create a list of security recommendations and tasks. A initial cybersecurity training, and that's something that you can purchase outside, videos. LinkedIn has a series of those that you can access if people have library access, and there's no budget at all for training. But there's also some fairly affordable options for just taking a video series and using that as your baseline. And in particular, your managers, depending on the size of your organization, need to have training in risk. This is true of, executive leadership as well as any frontline managers. And this slide contains screenshots of manager training I created in Adobe Express prior to beginning an inventory project for a nonprofit. And here you can see that communication style, it's not high tech. It actually uses themes from nature, emphasizes ideas around collaboration, and also touches on basic cybersecurity ideas like the CIA triad, or the fact that risk is not fully eliminated by cybersecurity controls. And that sort of lays the groundwork for managers being a part of the inventory process and then getting their teams involved in the inventory process. So, why is an inventory important? Well, an inventory is your foundation. An inventory is an invaluable resource. It is both a reference and a working document. It's an eye-opening training and awareness opportunity. And I say that because once you combine sort of your baseline training and the idea that you're looking for what data people are using, where it's stored, and who has access to it, it starts to open up conversations about how the data is being used. It often brings up ideas or concerns around how documents are shared, and often redundancy, that sometimes people are pulling down copies of documents, that there's actually multiple versions of documents. So that actually goes to the CIA triad, that the middle one, integrity, that if you have multiple versions of documents floating around, worst case scenario with highly sensitive information, that's a risk, because first of all, you can't keep track of all the copies. You don't know where they're going. Maybe too many people have access to that information, which also increases your chance of exposure. It starts this conversation that you wouldn't have had otherwise, but in the larger context of security, it is the one piece of the process that really gets people's attention. It also, though, is a basis for creating policies. Once you know where your data is and what devices it's being used on and what software and so forth, you get a better handle of what kind of policies that you'll need to create. It's also a tool for adapting an industry recognized cybersecurity framework, which is what I recommend that all nonprofits do, regardless of size. There are organizations, that nonprofits in particular, that have offered kind of a simplified version of a framework where I wouldn't say a framework, but more like an assessment where you answer questions and it gives you a sense of what you need to do or whether or not you're secure. But underlying those is generally a framework, although they've often kind of pick and choose pieces from a recognized framework. But I suggest that using the actual foundational framework makes more sense, and simply skip over those things that don't apply to your org, because you will grow into it over time. And the primary benefit to that, besides it being the guide for your work, is that using a recognized framework gives you a common communication tool that you can use to talk to vendors, regulators, funders. It's extremely useful. Whereas if you use a proprietary assessment, for example, that's not based on a framework or is very clearly mapped to one, you still will have to go through the process of translating that into a framework that someone outside your organization would understand. Having an inventory also supports succession planning. If you have a new manager, you have a new IT person, you have a new leader, executive leadership, or maybe you even change, you've got cybersecurity insurance or E&O insurance, and you need some kind of list of what you have, your inventory will give that to you. You will have already done the work. It will make that process easier. Finally, it guides your recovery efforts. So if you have a catastrophic intrusion, data is deleted, devices destroyed where you don't have access to software or accounts, your inventory gives you a list of what you had before the attack. And it can be essential to finding your way back, to rebuilding your infrastructure, to putting in place data, your backups, and so forth. So it's extremely useful. There isn't anything that you will do when you're building your asset inventory that will go to waste. You will reuse it constantly to support your security and your internal processes. So it is well worth the time and effort. Let's just look at the steps real quick. I've got 5 steps here. This is ultra simplified, but this is really the crux of it. You're going to make a list of your data, and I define assets widely, but we'll just talk about data for a minute. You'd make a list of your data and you would add it to the sheet. You classify that data by whether or not it's restricted, confidential, and internal. And I'll talk about that. estimate the impact of data compromise on the organization. If you have a data breach, is that catastrophic for your org? I mean, did they get 100,000 records, including credit card numbers? That would be catastrophic for an organization. Or is it just a name and emails, but no other identifying information? You will take time once you fill out your inventory to go through each one of your items and determine that and there's some guidance in the template that we provide to help you make that determination. Then you're going to fill in additional details in the template, which we'll look at the template coming up here. And then you would meet with a security professional to review it. They're going to help you fill in the gaps. It is, depending on the complexity of your systems and your inventory, it helps to have someone else look at your work. So first, let's talk about what assets are. This is defined pretty broadly. It is documents and databases. It's your knowledge. It's also the tools you use, anything from your social media accounts to the devices that connect to your, whether it's laptops, desktops, your printers may be connected to the internet. And then most critically is your processes, because ultimately that's what you're trying to protect. You're trying to protect the things that you are able to do in your organization that serves your communities. And if your data is corrupted or stolen, if your laptops are gummed up with malware, if your online accounts are locked down through ransomware, you are kind of out of luck in terms of being able to do your work that day. So if that happens, do you have an alternative process for getting payroll out or getting the newsletter out? Or is there some critical event that you need to make sure that you have a backup for processes so that that event goes on, even if you have an attack of ransomware? In the upper right corner of the slide, I also include having a list of your compliance responsibilities. And this is important because it helps you classify the inventory items in your sheet in terms of impact. Some data may not be linked to relevant regulatory concerns, and others might. And those that have high stakes, high consequences is something that would perhaps be a catastrophic impact for your organization. The other thing that you have to think about when you're putting information into your sheet, well, I should say after you put it in, is whether the information is considered restricted, confidential, and internal. So the confidential and internal are really something that you would determine as an organization what falls into those categories. The restricted is a little different. That is generally information protected by law. So that would be, say, bank account numbers, financial information, social security numbers, and other areas of compliance responsibility. If you're a healthcare organization, it would be healthcare records as it relates to HIPAA. Or if you handle data for children, it might relate to COPA. So this is something that making a list of your compliance responsibilities, which can be contractual as well as, say, state or federal, then that helps you kind of stay on track when you're trying to determine what assets are the most critical to protect. So let's take a look at the sheet here. I know it's small. You can look at the sheet from the resource link that you've received. Once we get the video out, all of the links and the resources will be in that email. But as you can see, there's a lot of columns here, and not to be overwhelmed. It's actually a multi-step process. The sheet has an introductory tab in the very front sheet with a list of instructions and each of the steps and how to move forward with that. And if you have questions, you can always make a free meeting appointment with us and ask questions about it. We'll be happy to walk you through it. This starts with identifying an asset owner. So an asset owner might be a programmer or an individual, but it's somebody who owns the data or uses it regularly. The next column B, is a description of that data. So that might be, in this particular case, this top line is an example that you can use. So in this example, the description for this particular data asset is that it's information from a volunteer application form. So then the next columns are yes or no columns about does that application form have a field for Social Security or date of birth, for example? Are there any elements that would fall under regulatory purview, say FERPA or HIPAA? Does it have personal health information, for example? And when you're filling this out, it helps to start by just doing a basic list in not trying to put it into this sheet initially, but really even sitting down with a pen and paper and just think about the data you use on a daily basis, where it lives. Maybe you start with the process and think about the data involved, or maybe you think about the data and think about the processes involved, and then what software. But you sort of make a list, very informal. And then once you do that, then take one of those items and start to put it in the sheet. It gets to the point where it can be a little overwhelming, especially depending on how you're organized your information online. So if you have, for example, MS365 and you've got a lot of files in SharePoint, and you may have a lot of personnel files, for example, but there's a mix. Maybe you have a folder that says HR and it's a combination of personnel files, but also onboarding training slides or policy copies of policies, or maybe it's some kind of an ad that you have posted on Indeed for recruiting. Those 4 items actually are very different in their data classification. So the advertisement for recruiting is really a public document because it's already out there. The onboarding training is most likely an internal, maybe confidential, depending on your policy, but an internal document. Obviously, your personnel records is probably a combination of confidentiality and restricted information. Some of it is probably protected by law, but it's all sitting in the same folder. And so it's also tedious to list every single document, right? That's too much. So the best way to get started when you're thinking about what to protect is the most critical items that are in a location, and you can just stop right there in terms of classification. So if I know that there's Social Security numbers sitting in that folder, I'm going to mark that folder. I'm going to put human resources folder, and I'm going to say restricted. And then I'm going to put in the notes, it also has these other items. I might flag it for what we might do in the future is keep the restricted information in a folder by itself, lock it down to just a couple people that should have access, and then the rest of it gets moved someplace else. But that's why it's unique to every organization, because your workflow really does depend on who needs access to what and vice versa. So one of the things that you can do once you have your inventory filled out is that you can create asset records. Asset records are particularly useful for software that you're using, so cloud services, and also your hardware. So if you own laptops as an organization, you would want to list your laptops and who they're assigned to. And if you have cloud services, which you most certainly do, then you want to have a record for your cloud application. And this is a example of a asset record in an Excel spreadsheet. And here you can see that this is an Adobe record. And this is extremely detailed. You certainly don't need all these fields, but you get the sense. Like you can see down here under the CIA triad, it lists whether it's important to have high availability or low availability. And you can also see here's an explanation of how it's backed up on this third column over here. Here is the field for the registration email. So you need to think about the kinds of information you should record in your record in case your instance is hacked. So let's say your administrative account, your primary, is hacked and you can't get into it anymore. If you call customer service to help ask for their help to get let back in, you may discover that you need to provide them all kinds of information that you don't have, like what is your originating email, or there might be a code you have to give for security purposes. Those kinds of things need to be recorded in your asset record. Your asset records and your data inventory, you need to have that stored in the cloud in more than one location. And you also need to have it printed out and have, someone who is a part of a list of folks who can respond if you have an incident, so you know who to call and they know where that dry list lives and can help you get back into your resources. The other thing that you can do with a completed inventory is create a data classification and use guideline. And this is what you will use to communicate to your team members on how to use specific kinds of data. So we'll look specifically at the restricted version here. So here, restricted means that there's a high risk of disclosure. If restricted information is disclosed, it becomes a high risk to the organization. It could require reporting to the Attorney General of your state. It could require an investigation. You may have to go to court. You may have to pay thousands or millions of dollars worth of fees. So it could be potentially very serious, or it could be as simply one record's disclosed but leads to vandalism or domestic abuse because that person's data has been exposed to someone who was stalking them. So it runs the gamut, all the reasons why we need to keep personal information private. What are some of the things that fall into that category? So this is where you would list not only, I suppose you could say generalities, but really you want to list the data that your organization specifically uses so it makes sense to your team members. In this case, it's bank account numbers, social security numbers, debit and credit card numbers, financial statements, authentication credentials. Anything human resources in this case is considered restricted. That isn't necessarily true by law, but this organization is saying, you know what, we're not taking chances. Everything falls under restricted. Personally identifiable information is generally considered restricted. The organization has an internal policy as to what that definition is, and anything that meets that definition falls under the restricted category. So then in that case, who has access to restricted information? Well, only authorized persons. Okay. We'll look at the other two. Confidential, you can see that under the who has access column, more people have access to it. And in this case, it may be transmitted through encrypted channels. So you could attach it to an email if the email was encrypted. And then internal, same thing, a wider group of people have access to it. This is information in the internal where it's not protected by law, but that it's generally not released to the public except under specific circumstances. And one way to think about that is that information that you generally wouldn't want the public to know. It's not necessarily, it could harm your reputation, or it's just proprietary information you don't want to share. So you do all of this work. How do you know how to put the controls in place to protect it? How do you know how to protect restricted information so that it's not hacked or leaked? That's where that is the difficult part, and that's usually where an IT or cybersecurity professional steps in to fill the gap. But if you don't have that resource, where can you start? So the suggestion is that you start with a framework, either the Center for Internet Security or CIS. You can Google that. And there'll be links in the resources. And this one, which is the NIST CSF. NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is a document that you can read, a spreadsheet that you can use. You can Google any one of these as you're working through. You can Google any one of these standards, and a plethora of information will pop up as to what controls to use and how to apply them. It's extremely easy to find things that will support NIST. It is created by the federal government. It is free. It is not proprietary. The Center for Internet Security is a nonprofit. They have a proprietary standard that's mapped to NIST, but most of the standards are mapped to NIST. So I suggest start with NIST. If you need something that's a little easier to navigate, you can use one of the other proprietary frameworks that are out there, but always map it back to NIST, because it may not be the most stringent of all of the standards, but it is widely recognized and it is constantly updated, and you can find information that you need easily online for it. Once you have your inventory and a list of security tasks, because you will develop those, you will translate those into cybersecurity do's and don'ts that are unique to your organization. You'll mention specifically the software that you use and the data that you use and the clients that might be impacted. It makes it real for your team members rather than the generic anti-phishing videos or your basic cybersecurity training. You want a baseline training, but this is where the awareness clicks and it becomes very relevant to your org. You'll create policies to support your safe work habits and comply with regulations and contractual obligations. So you can specifically mention them in your trainings and in your policy. We have access to federal database X. As a result of that access, we are expected to do these following things. As a result of those things that we need to do, we've put these controls in place. That's the kind of specificity that really does help people retain cybersecurity awareness training, and also getting them involved in putting those controls in place for their own processes and for their own teams also accelerates the understanding and the engagement. Then you want to make sure that team members with administrative privileges or access to sensitive data, such as human resources management or financial information, be your bookkeeper, your accountant, that they receive training that's related to their roles. So, for example, if you have an internal HR person who is running your payroll, they are very likely going to be on some hacker's list for phishing emails, trying to get them to disclose credentials or to share sensitive information about an employee. And that is a constant. It's usually heightened around tax time or the holidays, but extra training helps people with more privileges and access to highly sensitive information protect themselves and recognize attacks. There is a role for everyone in an organization for security. Everyone needs to own a security activity. The key is making that activity and that responsibility explicit, talking specifically about the kinds of data and software used and the organization's compliant obligations. Creating internal trainings is essential and should accompany any generic cybersecurity trainings that you offer or that you've purchased, so that you can ensure that the security principles are specifically linked and are relevant to your team members, to what they do every day. And this should include your volunteers who have access to your systems, your board members, contractors, and employees. One of the ways that you can create a security activity in a very broad sense across your organization is to create 2 additional roles that you use in your language when you are talking about cybersecurity principles and also just workplace policies. So one is called the resource owner, and the other is a data steward. If the understanding is that a data steward is anyone who has access to data and systems, and that they have the responsibility to do all of the things that the organization lays out as being important to protect the information that the organization needs or the systems, then it makes everyone a data steward. And that might mean that if you have a remote team, and let's say you share a Salesforce database, that every person who has access to that database is a steward. They are a steward not only of the data, their responsibility of putting in good, accurate data, and following whatever the rules might be for that. But they're also responsible for making sure that their home network, that where they're accessing the internet, is password protected, that they're not accessing the database in a public place, that they're stewards in terms of confidentiality. They're not working at a Starbucks where someone can look over their shoulder. That's an aspect of stewardship, and that would apply to anyone working remotely on anything that you would want to keep classified as internal or restricted or confidential. The second role is resource owner, and that belongs to people who have admin privileges in cloud applications or other types of administrative roles related to data and software. So in the example that I showed, I think I can find it here. This this asset record is for Adobe. So let's say you have a team member who is the administrator for Adobe, and they are responsible for assigning Creative Cloud licenses or Acrobat licenses. You would want that person to be very aware of what kind of security controls are available through the dashboard. They need to be aware of who has access, who has licenses. That needs to be a list that's written down and updated on a regular basis. They need to regularly update who has access. Does everyone have admin access, or is it just a couple people or just that one person? And then they're following the guidelines set out for being a resource admin. And that is the second role. So you could say that executive leadership is essentially a resource owner. And everyone is, of course, a data steward. And this makes it very specific then about how you can give every member of your organization a security activity. The thing that is most effective in small organizations is to distribute your security across the organization, because this is a long, ongoing process. I've seen well-meaning executive directors allocate staff time to one person to complete this task, with the expectation that once it's completed, they can move on to other things. But that isn't the best way to organize work that essentially never ends and that must be constantly updated, because threats change, technology changes, people leave. This is something that is a process and a structure that you put in place, and then you're going to constantly maintain it and nurture it. So for that reason, it works better to distribute the tasks across the organization with one person in charge of security overall, a team lead, or you can have an information security officer, someone who serves in that function, who has spent the time to read up and has taken some extra trainings and spearheads this. But the ultimate responsibility for putting all these pieces in place shouldn't just rest with them. It should be distributed among the teams. So this reinforces the ongoing awareness and then spreads the tasks to a wider group, which ensures that the routine chores get completed on a regular basis. It also keeps security in front of mind. It also creates the need to make it a meeting topic on a regular basis. And that's really the essence of security, is that it becomes a part of daily conversation. It's a part of what you do every day. And it stops being exceptional. It stops being the one training you do 1 hour a year, which leaves an organization very vulnerable to attack. This is a lot. Persistence is essential. You've got to just keep swimming. I have my little Dory slide. Until the early days of inventory and getting people involved and training folks and changing hearts and minds gives way to understanding and safety that is routine and integrated into an organization's work practices as consistently and simply as putting on a seatbelt in the car. That's the presentation in its total, and I'm happy to answer questions. We are available to do one-on-one meetings, mentor opportunity. There is a bunch of resources that we'll send out with the video, and I appreciate your time, and thank you for watching.